everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about 10 writing strategies that you can use in your writing to help the reader better understand what you're talking about and to help better explain your ideas. So let's get started. All right, so the 10 writing strategies that we will talk about today are cause and effect, classification, induction and deduction, compare and contrast, definition, description, narration, illustration, and refutation. All right, so the very first writing strategy we are going to talk about is cause and effect. So a lot of you have probably heard of this term before, and it's basically looking at why something happened in the first place, what could have prevented it from happening, and what will be the consequences of that thing. So it's basically an X leads to Y description. So this can help in all sorts of writing, and it really depends the message that you're trying to get across. So maybe in our later problem and solution essays, when you're trying to prevent something from happening or maybe stop it from happening, it's very good to understand what the original cause of it might be. So one way we might think of cause and effect is a simple domino effect, that you push over one domino in a line and the rest of the dominoes will eventually fall over. So we can think about this in all sorts of terms. So one cause and effect that used to happen a lot in my life before I trained my cat out of it was that my alarm would go off, which would cause my cat to start meowing like wild at my door. And because of that, I would wake up and not be tempted to hit my snooze button because my cat was going berserk, either meowing at the door or if he was in the room, stepping on my face and headbutting me and all sorts of things. So the original cause is the alarm going off, and the effect is my cat wanting to be fed, which eventually causes me to wake up. Okay, so there's a cause and effect that you all might be familiar with or might not. Okay, so the next idea is classification. And a lot of times we think about classification maybe in a science format where we have like genus, species, phylum, whatever the layers are, where you have a big umbrella topic, and that is the main topic. And then within that, you have subtopics and categories, and you can keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So that is our classification when you have one thing that kind of fits into an umbrella category. So again, we can break something into a subject and parts in order to evaluate them. We might say that these group of things are similar and these groups of things are similar. But when we start breaking down, like they do have differences within that group. When we're talking about writing, we may also decide to use headings and subheadings, which I do a lot in your assignment sheets, and you might find in a lot of textbooks where they have a large heading and then subheadings and subcategories as you go throughout. One thing that you should note, especially in writing, you don't typically want to have a heading unless you have at least 2 subheadings that go underneath it. This kind of follows the rules of bullet points and stuff like that. However, if it's just for you or your audience doesn't care about it, so what? You can do whatever you want. So that is how classification generally works. You have a broad umbrella category. I almost said Umbrella Academy. You have a broad umbrella category, and underneath it you have other categories that can be broken down smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to one specific type of thing. But you can talk about the large category or the small category and see how things work differently at different levels. So next we're going to talk about is induction and deduction. Now these work together, and it's working on how you come to a general truth or specific details. So in induction, you're working from the outside in toward a general truth. So you're saying this leads me to believe this. Okay, so one example might be if we're looking in a classroom, we might say, I asked 4 people in this classroom if they're students. So here's my evidence. I have 1 person said they're a student, 2 people said they're a student, 3, 4, you can continue asking. And the more people I ask, the more people say they're students. And therefore, I think everyone in this classroom is a student. Okay, so that is when you're taking information and you're moving in and finding a general truth. Now, deduction is the opposite. So you're working from a general truth and you're moving outwards, you're deducing. So you start with a general truth, as I said, and lead to specifics. So in this case, you might say classrooms are where students sit. So when I walk into this classroom, everybody there will be students. Okay, so you're working from the general knowledge and providing it in a different situation, or using that to assume, basically deduce, assume that everything is going to follow the general truth. Okay, the next one you are probably familiar with again is compare and contrast. So in comparing, you're pointing out similarities, and in contrasting, you're pointing out differences. So we have our Venn diagram here where if you're looking at the A and B, the outsides of the Venn diagram, you might be comparing the differences and contrasting them. Whereas if you're looking at the middle of the Venn diagram, you would be looking at how they're similar, how they're exactly the same or similar, not exactly the same, but close to the same. Okay, and in general, there are two methods for talking about comparison and contrast in your writing. So one way is to chunk. So you might talk all about A and then talk all about B. And a way that you might think about this is, so if you're talking about different phones, so you might say Android has all these features, and then iPhone has all these features. So you might talk about the security features, the accessibility features, blah, 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 that are commonly associated with Android phones. And then you would talk about the security, accessibility, and all the features on iPhones. Okay, so that would be chunking, where you do all of A and then all of B. Now, sequencing is a little bit different, where you are going to write about specific features between the two, keeping the features together. So in this case, you might talk about the accessibility of Android, and then you would talk about the accessibility of iPhone. And then you would talk about the security of Android and then the security of iPhone, and maybe the camera of specific phones and the camera of specific phone of iPhone. Okay, so that's where you're going back and forth saying like, this is the battery life here, the battery life there, the picture taking here, the picture taking there, the size of the memory on this phone and then this phone, which is different than the chunking where you're just saying, here's everything you need to know about one and then everything you need to know about the other. Okay, so let's look at our next, which is definitions. I'm sure, again, you're used to the understanding of what a definition is. It's basically just defining a term so that everybody knows you're on the same page. Now, a lot of times you might be using a very specific definition. So maybe you have one definition and you want to make sure that your reader understands you're working on that, working off that same definition. So maybe if you're talking about family, for instance, and in one case, family might refer specifically to people who are biologically related. And that might not include adopted children, that might not include stepchildren, stuff like that, okay? And then you have another model where you might say legal families, where it's like, okay, stepchildren, adopted children, these all fit. And then you might have another definition that says, you know, family is chosen, so maybe it's more about your friends and people you care to keep in your life more than the biological or legal definitions. Okay, so those are three different definitions of family, and if you are talking a lot about what family is and the importance of family, it might be beneficial to explain to your reader what definition you are using. Okay, so now there's a few different ways to work those definitions into your essay. The first is a simple sentence definition. You are saying family is a legal tie. Family, legal ties between individuals is important. Okay, so one is just saying blank is blank. The other, you might put it in parentheses. You might put it in an explanatory comma, which is basically a non-restrictive clause that is in between commas. It's my little commas there. Okay, so those are ways that you can incorporate a definition into an individual sentence. Now, sometimes your definition might need more than a simple sentence. So you might need an extended definition. So in this case, you might have to do some comparing and contrasting. So saying, you know, family is similar to these other things. It's different from these other things. It might also be like a negative definition by saying, you know, a cat is a thing that's not a dog. Or if you're doing compare and contrast, a cat is similar to a dog in that it has fur. Most varieties of cat have fur. They have great hearing. They have great smelling. They have 4 legs most of the time. Okay, so those are our comparisons. But then you might say, unlike a dog, a cat typically has pointy ears. They have a smaller face. They're generally smaller, even though, you know, dogs have certain smaller breeds. Okay, so those are kind of going our compare and contrast, where you might need a paragraph or even more to kind of define what exactly makes a cat different from a dog. Okay, another thing we might be thinking about is historical definitions. So this is especially important maybe if you're looking at literature, or certainly if you're going into history. So you're looking at how a word might change over time. So some things to think about is, what was the definition of family in the 1950s? What did it mean in 1900? And especially with some words that change their meaning over time, such as like awful, which at this point in time, we think it's something terrible. Whereas historically, if you go back far enough, it means full of awe. So it's a very different, different definition. So for example, if you're looking at a much older script, a piece of writing that uses the term awful, and you find out at the time that it was written that awful actually meant full of awe and not terrible, that would hugely change the actual meaning of the text. Okay, so there's one example where it's absolutely important to know when something was written and how to know how they were using language, which kind of goes into our context and occasion of like when and where are things happening. Okay, and the last is a stipulative definition. So this especially goes if you are looking at something from a way that is different than the common knowledge. So for example, in my definitions of family, if I was talking about family as, you know, the people you choose to surround yourself with, so maybe your best friends and people you're close to, this is obviously going to be a different definition than the traditional definition, which includes like legal and blood relations. Okay, so especially if you're using something like that, you want to make sure your reader knows that you are using a different definition. And I think this happens a lot too with academia, where certain words are used frequently, such as like well-being. And you want to make sure that your readers are with you to understand exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about well-being, because different researchers are using the same term, but they're using it a little bit differently. Okay, so those are times when you really want to make sure that you have a clear definition to explain what it is that you are talking about so that your reader and you are on the same page. Okay, so now let's look at the next, which is description. So in description, you are creating an intense, distinctive image that brings the words to life. So this is the time when you're trying to show the reader what's happening instead of telling them what is happening. You want them to be able to close their eyes and imagine that they are right there, that they can see what is happening in their mind's eye. So there's a few different ways to create a great description. So the first is to name something, what is going on. So for example, instead of saying, I grabbed my cell phone, you could say, I grabbed my iPhone Gen 10, or I grabbed my Samsung Galaxy 9. So at that point, you're going from this general idea of a cell phone to a very specific idea by naming what it is that you are grabbing. So that is one way of naming. You can also describe specific features or parts. So if you're talking about a chair, you can specifically name that it has armrests and a wooden back and different stuff like that, and just state that those things exist so that your reader is building up an idea in their head of what this thing actually looks like. The next is by detailing, so making features very specific. So this, you might say it is a large chair or a tiny chair for a kindergartner. Maybe there are 5 chairs or 2 chairs. So again, this is when your reader closes their eyes to imagine the scene, that they're populating chairs in their mind. Is it 5, 2, 20, however many? All right, and then the next might be where is it? So if you have a room and you say it's in the northeast corner, and the reader can move their items in their head. And lastly, like the condition. So is it old? Is it new? Is it broken down? So these are all the details that you can add. So it's basically these adjectives that you can add to your writing so that your reader can better paint a picture in their mind of what the area looks like, what the thing looks like, etc. Next is thinking about comparing, and there's two specific ways of, I don't know why I held up three. There are two specific ways of comparing. So similes, in which you use like or as, and metaphors, where you are using an implicit comparison. So one way to think about this is to say, like, when my spouse came home after 2 weeks, I was as excited as a puppy. So saying like I was as excited as a puppy, I'm not saying I am a puppy, that we can draw that comparison. Okay, and then metaphors would just be saying like I was an excited puppy when my spouse came home after 2 weeks. So it's saying I was that thing versus I was like that thing. And both of those are drawing these comparisons between two things. And the last is sensing. So that's really just using your five senses. You can talk about what the air smells like. Maybe you have wafting brownies fresh out of the oven, or what you can hear, there's birds chirping in the distance, or anything that you can see. What does the air feel like on your skin or a blanket? Is it fuzzy? Is it rough? And taste of something bitter or sweet or salty? Does it taste like chai tea, for example? So bringing up these sensory details so that your reader can really jump in and imagine that they are going through that story with you. Okay, now let's think of the next one, narration. So if we look back at our types of writing, this goes into description and narration as being two types of writing that are very similar and combined. So in narration, we often have description, but they don't always go together. All right, so narration is when you're telling a story to make a point. So a lot of times, for example, you might be trying to argue that, say, we need healthcare to accept people with pre-existing conditions. So instead of just telling all the facts about, here is why, like, we have this many million people living with pre-existing conditions in the United States, and this is how much money they have to pay per year because they have a pre-existing condition. And of course, like, those facts and statistics work really well, but one thing you might do as well is tell a story about one person with a pre-existing condition who is denied healthcare coverage. And these emotional appeals that you're making in your reader can often go farther than, just telling people facts and statistics, because they start to imagine that all these facts and statistics are about individual people. And when you start telling the stories of people, a lot of times we care a little bit more. Okay, so you might have all your plot lines and your rising action and everything like that. So it could be in your essay, you might tell a little story, or maybe you make it like a fable where there's a moral to the story and you aren't specifically bringing out any facts or figures or anything like that. You're just trying to get people to believe a point based on an individual story. Okay, so the next is illustration, and this kind of works alongside narration. You're basically giving a specific example. So you're giving a big picture and showing an in-depth part of one example of the whole. So in this case, you might say this is what healthcare looks like in general, and here is one piece that you should really care about, and maybe, again, telling the story of one person. And as I said, like, illustration and narration kind of work together in this way, but you're really just zooming in on one part of the problem or one part to really help people see that piece in depth, where you might not be able to go in depth about every single point along the line. So our next is refutation, and this is basically you're disputing a person's argument. This is really important, especially when you're talking about a polarizing topic, such as birth, abortion, or gun control, or when a writer disagrees with a claim. So basically, when you're refuting a claim, you're going to go through your arguments. So you might say, you know, this is why abortion should be illegal, A, B, C, and then say, you know, my writers, people reading this might disagree with my points, and here's what they believe, and say, like, here's what they believe, and this is why I believe that's not true, or why you shouldn't believe that as well. So it's bringing up a point and saying, hey, here's what I believe, here's what the opposition believes, and here's why you shouldn't believe what the opposition believes. And that, again, can be used in stories or facts and statistics, etc. Now, the big thing when you are trying to refute a claim is that you really want to be fair. You don't want to attack somebody personally. You don't want to, you know, just punch them to the ground with what you feel. You want to be fair and like recognize that we're all human beings with feelings and beliefs. And most importantly, you want to be well informed. You want to understand what the other person actually believes so that you aren't saying like, the sky is blue and you should believe that. And they're like, I already believe the sky is blue. Why are you arguing with me about that? Okay, so you want to make sure that you understand what the other person believes. And you also want to be able to fairly and logically argue for your side. So if you're saying like, no, the sky is red and you should definitely believe the sky is red, and people look up and they're like, no, it's not, and you just haven't been out of your house for days, then you're completely lost because your argument doesn't make sense because you don't know your points. Okay, so you want to, like, when you're refuting and basically whenever you're making an argument, you want to know your perspective. Obviously, you want to know a lot about your topic in order to be able to talk about it well. And when you're refuting, you really want to know what the other people believe and what they argue. So you really have to know your audience. So thank you for listening. Those are our 10 writing strategies. Obviously, there are a lot more, but we went over cause and effect, classification, induction, deduction, compare, contrast, definition, description, narration, illustration, and refutation. Now, hopefully that helps you better understand some ways that you can improve your writing and work in so that people and your reader understand exactly what you're trying to say and you can better get your points across. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you. Bye.